Hello, and welcome to another episode of my Type 35 build. The bare chassis isn't quite so bare today, as the front and rear suspensions have been fitted for preliminary mock-up. The front is pretty straightforward. The leading cross member was drilled and tapped to allow the front leaf springs to be held into position in order to determine the relative location of the rear spring hanger, which will need to be fabricated along with a shackle to allow the spring room to flex as the suspension cycles. I still haven't decided whether to run the shackle on the rear of the springs like an original Type 35 or on the front of the springs like the Type 59s did. I'll have to give that some more thought. Though I did place the front axle across the springs to give a better idea of how everything will look once it's finished. While the front is all business, the back is where the party's at. The rear suspension very closely mimics the original Type 35's arrangement, with a long lower link on the outside of the chassis that has a bushing and spacer installed to allow the rod end to sit outboard as far as possible in the control arm pocket, and quarter elliptical springs splayed outwards from the rear supporting the car. I wasn't 100% sold on the idea of the rear springs locating the axle laterally though. It can be done, obviously, but there are downsides. To avoid ugly things like spring wrap and massive pinion angle changes during suspension travel, I decided to triangulate suspension to the rear. The upper control arms bolt to the existing upper mount on the rear axle and angle outwards towards the rear crossmember. So now not only is wheelbase and pinion angle fully adjustable, but since the leaf springs bolt into a pivot welded to the bottom of the rear crossmember and offer the ability to adjust ride height with a pair of weight jack bolts, I decided to extend those bolts up through the top crossmember plate and used them to locate the upper control arm mounts, allowing me to reduce the number of big heavy fasteners, but also builds in an anti-squat adjustment by varying the height of the chassis side rod end and thus the angle of the upper control arm. The whole arrangement is just really cool and looks just stellar. I still have to fabricate a shackle and shock mount between the springs and rear axle, but there are also some Dagmars that may have caught your attention. In the middle of the car are a series of tabs that were attached to the center crossmember and are mounting points for the belly pan of the car. They're named trick tabs, and their claim to claim is that they can mount to any tube diameter, which is cool, but they didn't work exactly like I wanted. The back of the tab sat on top of the tube, which would have spaced the floor too low. I wanted the floor to sit flush against the crossmember, so I cut the back of the tab off and ground it to an angle so when they were welded on, they were flush mounted instead of surface mounted. One of those details that isn't really noticeable, but goes a long way to making the car's final appearance more finished. And speaking of finished, much easier to see is the outside of the chassis, and attached to it, the extensive number of rivnuts that have been installed. If you can't guess what they're for, when the car's finished, all these rivnuts will allow the body to mount to the side of the chassis, similar to an original Type 35. I think there's 75 so far, and more to come once the bulkheads are installed. It's like so cool, I just can't stop staring at it.